Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.56, Meet the Loyalists. One of the challenges that I have had this season has come from the question of what exactly I should call everybody involved in this war. I have talked about this a few times before and legitimately have struggled to find terms that I am happy with. Now, this might sound like a pretty minor thing, but words do matter. How we describe an individual or group of people can have profound effects on just how we think of them. Probably the most correct term that I could have gone with would have been Whigs and Tories. This is the language that was used by those at the time. However, considering that those terms also refer to British political parties, I decided against using them to avoid any unintentional confusion. I have generally avoided using terms like rebels because I think it undersells the gravity of the movement in America. The British ministry had long been operating under the false assumption that the American Revolution was far more of a limited matter. A bunch of rebels leading along a reluctant population that still eagerly hoped to greet their rightful king. Considering that we have talked about how that was very much not the case, referring to this group as rebels seems to be a bit misleading. Patriots is another popular term, as is the one that I have most often found myself using, referring to the sides simply as the Americans and the British. This has been the easiest thing for me to fall into, and I feel confident that you all understand exactly who I'm talking about when I use those terms. Now, I'm not going to change things up now, and I plan on continuing to use those terms throughout the rest of the season. However, I would argue that they still come with their own, often serious slate of problems that we need to understand if we are going to fully understand the war that is taking place. What is an American? What is a patriot? Was Thomas Hutchinson not an American patriot? He was born in Massachusetts in 1711, the great-grandson of Anne Hutchinson, who was one of the early founders of Rhode Island. Hutchinson had lived his entire life in America, right up until the moment that he was forced into exile in 1774. He fought hard for his government and as a result often found himself at odds with the more radical elements in Boston. Hutchinson endured everything from name-calling, to his house being destroyed, to the constant ridicule of the population that he was in charge of governing. He did all of this because he was a loyal and patriotic subject. We can have this same conversation over a whole lot of people. Joseph Galloway was a prominent Philadelphian. He was absolutely invested in the struggle of the American colonists, and although his conviction was wavering at this point, he was a delegate to the First Continental Congress. William Franklin was the governor of New Jersey, as well as the son of Benjamin Franklin. There is no question that these men were Americans. Likewise, can we really call them unpatriotic when their actions that brought so much attention to themselves during this period was their decision not to throw off their government? What about Benedict Arnold, whom we are going to talk much more about later on today? Arnold served, albeit briefly, in the Connecticut militia during the French and Indian War, fighting for the British. When the war broke out, he sided with the Americans before switching sides back to the British cause. Today, Arnold stands as the most prominent traitor in the history of the United States. His name is synonymous with being a turncoat. But who was he a traitor towards? Was it Great Britain when he joined the Revolution on the side of the Americans? Was it the Americans when he chose to switch his allegiances back? These questions are difficult to answer because the answer in many cases is complicated. There were a lot of people living in America in the 1770s who remained loyal to the British. In their eyes, their compatriots were the traitors, choosing to abandon their country for independence. Many of these men and women were just as patriotic as those who were fighting for independence, just that their patriotism was pointed back towards the British. Of course, not everybody was a Hutchinson, Galloway, or Franklin, and often the decisions of which horse to back in the war came down to more pragmatic decisions. Questions over property, being displaced, and becoming a refugee, family connections, and employment just as often determined who you were going to fight for. In our episode today, we are going to spend our time looking at the Loyalists living in the United States during the war. What were their lives like, and how were they treated by the British? How were they viewed by the Americans? At the end of our episode today, we are going to turn to the question of Benedict Arnold and discuss how a man that had, to date, been so critical to the revolution will soon become one of the most despised figures in the history of the United States. To begin our discussion for today, I want to look at who the Loyalists were. What made somebody decide to remain loyal to the crown, despite seemingly all of those around them fighting for independence? The answer is that the Loyalists were a diverse group with many potential reasons. Approximately 20% of the citizens in the former colonies identified as being Loyalists. Some of these people held deep political beliefs and decided to remain loyal because, in their mind, it was the right thing to do. However, more often than not, the decision to be a Loyalist came down to far more practical considerations. At the end of the day, the overwhelmingly vast majority of people on both sides of the war were just everyday men and women trying to live their lives. Among the lawyers, many chose to remain loyal because they were well versed in English law. The last thing that they wanted was for the revolution to come in and totally upend the legal system, leaving them in uncharted waters. In reality, the legal system did not end up going through terribly radical changes at the end of the day. But during the war, they had no way to know that. Large merchants and farmers often remained loyal because they had lucrative trade agreements with the British already in place, agreements that they hoped would resume after the war. Sometimes the decision to remain loyal with the crown was more personal. The regulators in North Carolina are a good example of this. Recall that this is the group being led by Herbert Husband. We last talked about them back in episode 4.33. Well, the regulators don't seem to have any great love for the British. Their beef was largely with local leaders and large landowners in the state. The same people who were now taking on leadership roles in the fight for independence. Many of the regulators remained loyal simply out of spite. They already hated that group of leadership, and they were not about to support their ascension to the leadership over an entirely new nation. A similar situation would play out in Maryland, where a local militia formed that despised the local planters and lawyers in the colony, who they felt were busy forcing a system of inequality upon them. When the revolution came, it was those same planters and lawyers who they hated so much who ended up supporting the American cause. Now, if the locals already hated these men, the very last thing that they wanted was to live in a government even more controlled by them than before. Hence, their decision to remain loyal. Many of the Loyalists may have still harbored sympathies and even tacit support at times for the American cause, but they were unwilling to support the idea of a full separation. Several of the delegates to the Stamp Act Congress would remain loyal after the outbreak of the war. Joseph Galloway was a delegate to the First Continental Congress. He too would remain loyal. Galloway acts as a good example of somebody who absolutely harbored sympathies for the American cause. During the First Continental Congress, Galloway advocated the creation of an American Parliament that would have had the authority to veto legislation passed in the colonies from the British Parliament. This position was far beyond what Parliament would have ever considered allowing in 1774, but it is noteworthy because clearly Galloway understood and agreed with the American position. For Galloway, regardless of his sympathies though towards this cause, he never supported this war because he found it to be unnecessary. In many cases, the decision to remain loyal or join the American cause came down to a pragmatic one. For many women, the question of their own political beliefs were irrelevant. What mattered was what their husbands' political alignments were. We are going to talk more later today about the role of women, because despite being so often overlooked by the men, they would prove to play a critical role in the spread of information on both sides of the conflict. In the case of Benedict Arnold, his decision to turn back to the British came not from any political conviction in the cause of remaining loyal to George III, but rather from feeling wronged by the political leadership in the United States. Arnold felt underappreciated to the point where he became disillusioned with the entire American cause, and would end up betraying that cause as a result. we are going to spend much more time later today looking at the very specific case of Benedict Arnold. Of course, for others, the best plan was just to keep their heads down as much as possible. Nobody was really sure how the war was going to end, and picking the wrong course may well prove to be a dangerous bet. For some people, therefore, the best move was to try to remain as flexible as possible in their position, in order to prepare for any possible outcome. It can be easy to believe that the Loyalists were these evil misers, sitting in their mansions, somehow immune from the tides of revolution going on all around them. Much of this comes directly from how we like to envision the history of the United States. If we break things down into a battle between the good guys, the American patriots, and the bad guys, those tyrannical British, then the Loyalists exist in a space where they are an extension of those tyrannical British. In fact, not only are they an extension of the British, but they are vocal supporters of the British who, obviously, are supporters of tyranny and the denial of the natural rights of the Americans. The problem is that pretty much everything about this view is wrong. Many of those who chose to remain loyal did have American sympathies. We have already talked about Joseph Galloway. Plus, let us not forget that Thomas Hutchinson had, once upon a time, worked with Benjamin Franklin on the Albany Plan of Union. Loyalists had their reasons for not supporting the cause of independence. However, it is completely unfair to paint them as being anti-American, especially since many of them were just as American as those fighting for independence. The truth is, Loyalists often lived right in the middle of everything else that was going on. At the beginning of her book, Generous Enemies, historian Judith von Berskirk tells the story of a raid on a small British-occupied town along the coast of Long Island. Such raids were commonplace throughout the war, and for the most part, they were minor enough affairs that they have remained outside the story of this podcast. The raid in December 1778 was no different, and would have no meaningful impact on the outcome of the war. What makes this raid important for us today, though, is that it was carried out by men who had lived in that town prior to the war. As planned, they landed, partook in some looting of supplies, and in this particular instance, captured a local loyalist. With their business all wrapped up, you would think that they would hop back on their boats and return home. It was never a good idea to linger for too long in enemy territory. Except that's not what they did. As I mentioned just a moment ago, these same men had lived in the town prior to the war. Returning to Long Island for the purpose of grabbing supplies was the primary objective, yes, but many of those same men would take the opportunity to visit with their parents. Although the children, now men, had chosen to join the cause of independence, their parents had remained loyal. Sure, there was a political disagreement in the family, but in the 18th century, children loved their parents exactly like they do today. Yes, there was a war going on, and yes, there were political differences. However, that seemed like an insufficient reason to cut off loved family members. For the leadership on both sides, this presented a serious problem. There was a war going on, and from a practical standpoint, it probably was not a good idea to have people in the British-occupied zones openly entertaining the enemy, familial connections notwithstanding. Despite pleading that the meeting was one that was in no way connected to the war and only existed as a chance for parents and children to reunite, the British had little choice, banishing the offending parties from the British-occupied zone. Such incidents of divided loyalties within families was hardly a rare occurrence. We know, of course, of Benjamin Franklin and his son William. However, in New York alone, he was joined by Gouverneur Morris, John Jay, Lord Stirling, and Horatio Gates in having close family connections to people who remained loyal. Morris's own brother was a general in the British Army. New York would prove to be a critical location for the Loyalists, as it would, for the majority of the war, remain in British hands. Throughout the country, towns and cities frequently changed sides, but from the time the British captured the city of New York in 1776 until their evacuation in 1783, New York remained firmly in British control, much to the chagrin of General Washington. This would present problems unique to that state. Unsurprisingly, many Loyalists would plant their flag in New York City during the occupation. With their own towns and cities being controlled by the Americans, New York provided something of a safe haven. As we talked about a moment ago, however, with the war dividing so many American families, there was a desire by many to cross enemy lines in order to visit with loved ones. For the leadership on both sides, this caused a headache. Both Clinton and Washington understood the risk of having people cross the lines, even if it was for a generally noble reason of visiting with family. This situation provided women with a degree of flexibility that was often denied to the men. Now, in the 18th century mind, men were dangerous, and although passes into the British-occupied zones were occasionally given to men, women could often pass with far more ease and much less suspicion. As Judith von Buskirk puts it, women were considered weak and childlike. Females could go where few males dared, because they were not considered to be a threat. The obvious problem with this is that despite how men felt about the threat level posed by women, they were very much paying attention. With women being able to pass easily into enemy-held territory in New York in order to visit their Loyalist family members, they quickly became critical links of information. Women spread news, information on rumors that they had overheard, and military intelligence. The fact that the information flowed in both directions meant that both sides were looking to do what they could to plug up the free flow of information and supplies. In addition to trading information, there was a healthy trade of goods moving between New York and her neighboring states. This likewise was a problem for both sides, and something that officials were eager to stop. New Jersey, as the closest neighbor to New York, passed numerous laws throughout the war to stem the flow of goods and communications, often meeting little success. Well, relationships between the Loyalists and their friends and family on the other side of the war were one thing. The relationship between the Loyalists and the British mark another interesting point about the reality of war. We have talked at length previously, as recently as episode 4.53, about the idea that the British told themselves about the large number of Loyalists who were just itching to join the cause. These reassurances that the revolution was an affair limited to a small number of radical actors in the Congress provided reassurance for the British that when they moved south, they would find a welcoming population eager to help them and ready to embrace their British brethren. Although the ministry back in London was talking about how most Americans did remain loyal, I have not really found much to indicate just how much they believed the words that they were saying. There is ample evidence, in fact, that this was not the case. At the very least, Henry Clinton seemed to understand the score. He was politically astute enough to recognize that he should probably just go along with it. But he seems well aware that he was unlikely to find those droves of Loyalists eager to embrace him. Many of the Loyalists were not looking to join the British in the fight, but rather were eager to turn to them for protection. When Clinton abandoned Philadelphia in June 1778, he took with him nearly 3,000 Loyalists who were desperate to get out of the city before the Americans retook it. They were all betting on the fact, not incorrectly, that upon Washington retaking the city, there would be steep reprisals. The problem is that in a war, this influx of refugees did little but slow the British army down. In a world where finding enough food to keep the troops fed was a constant concern, adding all of those additional mouths to feed was nothing shy of a logistical nightmare. Years before when it had been Lord Howe playing cat and mouse with George Washington in New Jersey, Howe made a proclamation that he would offer pardons to anybody who would agree to make their submission to Great Britain known. This was obviously a play to peel away support from the American cause, and hopefully swing those who were having second thoughts back to the British. Ironically, this influx of mouths, combined with Washington's mission to destroy as much forageable goods as possible, meant that Howe was forced to take goods from local farmers. This came with the unintended consequence of pretty much ensuring that many of these newly exploited farmers would be shoved firmly into supporting the American cause. Well, many would evacuate Philadelphia along with Clinton. For those who chose to remain behind, and those who collaborated with the British, they quickly found out just what those reprisals would look like. Yet, even here, we see just how complicated an issue this really was. Following the British withdrawal from the city, a series of treason trials were launched, aiming to punish those who had remained loyal to the British and had offered aid and collaboration with the enemy. Yet in these trials, which lasted from September 1778 until September 1782, of the 46 people in Pennsylvania who would go on trial for treason, there would be 38 acquittals and just 8 convictions. When the British decided to withdraw from Philadelphia to consolidate their troops in New York, it was a decision that came over the vocal objection of the local loyalists. Joseph Galloway did what he could to change their minds, arguing that such an abandonment would cause many loyalists to switch allegiance to the American cause, largely out of changing self-interest. Surprisingly, to this, General Howe agreed with Galloway, and indeed encouraged the local loyalist population to do what they needed to do. Howe, ever the pragmatist, understood the position that these people were now going to be put in, and fully understood what the withdrawal from Philadelphia would mean for them. Should they evacuate with the British, they would become refugees, forfeiting their property and prior lives, likely forever. Should they choose to stay, they would face what would likely be a very vengeful population, with the risks being that much higher. Ultimately, Galloway chose to evacuate with the British. Though wanting to protect his property, he decided that his wife could stay behind, under the hopes that the Americans probably would not execute her. With Benedict Arnold becoming the military commander in Philadelphia, something that we're going to talk about more in a few minutes, he would end up promising Grace Galloway protection from physical harm, but stopped short of agreeing to protect her property. In fact, as she soon would learn, nobody was terribly eager to help her protect the family property. In the end, she was allowed to keep a bag of her personal clothes, but everything else from the family was unceremoniously taken over the ignored objections of Grace Galloway. With the Americans clearly okay with the idea of confiscating Loyalist property, the question shifts to those treason trials and why the conviction rate was less than 20%. Much of the decision for the widespread acquittals seems to have derived from the process itself. Professor of Law Carlton Larson, in his book The Trials of Allegiance, looks at the process of selecting both grand jurors and juries, and how that process was largely done in such a way that it helped ensure the outcomes. Many of those being accused of treason were known to the grand jurors. Everybody knew somebody who had remained loyal. As we have seen today, oftentimes people would retain those personal relationships that had existed before the war, in spite of the other political differences that they may have had. Once indictments were handed down, the jury selection process further helped to secure those acquittals. As is the case today, both the prosecution and defense would move to strike jurors for cause, some legal reason that they were unable to serve. However, only the defense received peremptory challenges, those challenges to a juror for pretty much any reason that you like. Furthermore, the defense got a stunning 35 strikes, meaning that the defense had a huge amount of control in just who was going to land on their juries. Add that to the fact that people routinely sat on multiple trials. It made it very easy for the defense to tailor-make juries that would, predictably, yield favorable verdicts. The reasons for the frequent acquittals in the trials is itself a complex subject that goes far beyond the factors that I just mentioned here. We could easily have an entire episode on the subject. However, this season is already getting pretty long, and eventually we probably do need to move the narrative forward. The important takeaway, though, for our purposes today is that, well, property confiscation was common. Actual convictions for treason remained far more rare. Despite finding themselves on the wrong side of the conflict, those old relationships with those who were now choosing the Loyalist cause remained a topic on the minds of those who were deciding the fate of those same Loyalists. To wrap things up for today, we are going to look at the single biggest case of divided loyalties in the entire war: the tragic case of Benedict Arnold. Now, I say tragic case, which, before doing this podcast, is hardly the phrasing I would have personally chosen for the man. To be clear, Arnold is a traitor. He absolutely was trying to sell out the Americans. However, it is also hard to ignore that, throughout the course of this show, there are few generals that we have spent more time with. Arnold has, time and time again, proven himself to be a very capable soldier, as well as a brave and talented leader. Yet, we have also seen more than once that Arnold lacked the political grace and acumen that might have helped accelerate his career. This is something that we talked at some length about back in episode 4.45. In the aftermath of Saratoga, Arnold was largely forgotten about as congratulations were being handed out. Despite his very central role in securing that victory, Arnold had very nearly died running into battle at Bremen's Redoubt. It was a feat that deserved the adulation of his colleagues. Certainly, Arnold received such admiration from the troops. However, by this point, Horatio Gates absolutely hated Arnold's guts. It therefore should come as little surprise that when Gates was reporting on the victory and handing out credit for the monumentous victory, Arnold's name was conspicuously absent. Only begrudgingly did Gates acknowledge that Arnold had acted valiantly during the battle, though he stopped well short of projecting any kind of credit for the victory onto him. Historian and Benedict Arnold biographer James Kirby Martin speculates that if Arnold had just done Gates a solid and died from his injuries, Gates would have never even bothered to mention his name at all. With Arnold busy convalescing from his leg injuries, he was absent from the final surrender of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga. He likewise missed out on the chance to take a victory lap of self-promotion for his actions. With Arnold down for the count, it was Gates who was able to soak in the victory and the congratulations that poured in as a result. To be sure, Arnold's role in the victory, overlooked as it was by Gates, was anything but inconsequential. This was a fact recognized by, of all people, John Burgoyne, who personally credited Arnold, not Gates, with his defeat. Despite this, though, Gates had no interest in helping rehabilitate Arnold's already sagging reputation, instead leaving him languishing in a hospital bed, really wishing that the musket ball had instead hit him in the heart. Arnold's wounds at Saratoga had indeed been severe. By the time that he had healed, as much as one would consider him healed, his left leg was a full 2 inches shorter than his right leg. For the rest of his life, the leg would cause Arnold considerable pain. This, combined with a general depression that settled over him, had Arnold in a pretty dark place. Washington had tried to salvage some of Arnold's hurt feelings with the promises of a commission, but it seems that by this point, Arnold was over it. He was over all of it. Having been largely ignored in the aftermath of Saratoga, Washington met with Arnold during the early spring of 1778. Now, George Washington was always amongst Arnold's biggest, and often only, champions, and was internally struggling at this point over the question of what to do with him. Returning to James Kirby Martin, by the timing of the visit, Arnold personally had come to feel betrayed by everything and everybody. He was mad at those delegates in Congress who so often ignored and passed him over. He found rivals for power everywhere, rivals who seemed to get far more recognition for far less a sacrifice than he had made. Most importantly, however, Arnold was growing disenchanted with the very cause itself. Washington made Arnold the military commander in Philadelphia in 1778, a position that Washington thought Arnold could excel in, despite his physical limitations. The problem with this, however, is that it put Arnold in a position of having to deal with the congressional delegates that he had come to so deeply despise. During his time in the position, Arnold found himself taking up the cause for the family of the deceased Dr. James Warren. After his death at Bunker Hill, Warren's family had been left nearly destitute. Arnold was appalled that a man who had given literally everything had been so completely forgotten by both the delegates in Philadelphia and by his home state of Massachusetts. Although Arnold would ultimately succeed in getting the payment to be made, the entire ordeal had done nothing to lift his skepticism about everybody involved. Arnold raged over the appalling behavior of the delegates towards Warren, a situation that resolved just mere weeks before his own personal betrayal. It seems somewhat fitting that a battle over keeping Dr. Warren's family from destitution would be the final thing that Arnold did for his country. It is impossible to believe that Arnold was not reading himself into that situation as he fought for James Warren. With his debilitating injury, Arnold could hardly miss the fact of how much both men had given, and just how little anybody seemed to care. The beginning of the end for Arnold came in 1779, when he was accused of dereliction of duty. This largely trumped-up political charge ended up with a conviction, with Congress ordering Washington to reprimand Arnold. Washington, ever dutiful to the civil command, obeyed, solidifying in Arnold's mind that he no longer had any friends. Even before this final indignity, Arnold had begun a correspondence with British Major John Andre. Well, possible that an acquittal would have been enough to put a stop to their conversations, Arnold clearly had already traveled past the breaking point. In August of 1780, Washington made a final attempt to assuage Arnold's hurt feelings, offering him the command over the Army's left wing for a potential attack on New York. Arnold, however, declined to take up the command, and asked only to be made the commander of West Point, something which Washington agreed to. The irony here is, of course, Washington had fully believed that by giving Arnold command over the American left, it would finally vindicate and satisfy the aggrieved Arnold. What Washington had not understood, and really could not have understood, is that by the time that this offer was being made, Arnold had already gone past the point of no return and had agreed to hand West Point over to the British on a silver platter. Arnold rejected Washington's overtures and requested West Point as his command because Arnold had already agreed to commit treason. The plan for Arnold was going well, right up until September 22nd. That morning, Arnold had met with John Andre to finish up the plans for handing West Point over to the British. Andre, on his way back to Manhattan, ran smack into an American guard who quickly captured him. News of Andre's capture, as well as information about those questionable papers that Andre was carrying with him, was sent along to Arnold in Washington. Now, Washington was already on his way to West Point for a visit with Arnold. When the courier with this information failed to find him, he rerouted to West Point where the general was heading. As some of Washington's staff arrived ahead of the general, who was traveling with Lafayette and Hamilton, everybody sat down to breakfast. It was while dining that Arnold learned of Andre's capture. He excused himself, told his wife Peggy Shippen what was going on, told those at breakfast that he needed to attend to something and that he would be right back. And then he took off as quickly as he possibly could, well aware that he was now just moments away from the entire world crashing down upon him. Washington arrived shortly after Arnold had gone sprinting away. At this point, George Washington and company still had no idea what was up. Everybody found themselves milling around, wondering exactly where Arnold had gone. Washington moved from the house that Arnold was staying at to nearby West Point, where Washington became even more perplexed. Where was Benedict Arnold? That particular question was answered at 4 p.m., when Washington received the documents taken from Andre. It took virtually no time for Washington to connect the dots, and suddenly he fully understood Arnold's absence. Wasting little time, Washington ordered Alexander Hamilton to take some men and chase after Arnold, while Washington and Lafayette went to pay a visit on Peggy Shippen. Shippen was absolutely beside herself with grief. Neither Washington nor Lafayette could do anything to calm the apparently stunned and inconsolable Shippen. Washington and Lafayette, completely lost as to what to do, would quietly excuse themselves. Based on her reaction, it was clear that Peggy Shippen was as surprised as everybody else. Satisfied that she knew nothing, Washington let Shippen travel to her family in Philadelphia. But as it would turn out, Shippen was not completely innocent. In fact, she was very much aware of what was going on, and had been the one to start the correspondence between her husband and the British spy John Andre. And the Oscar goes to Peggy Shippen. I'm going to have more to say about the fallout from Arnold's treachery in a future episode. Plus, we are going to talk in the future about John Andre's fate. However, for now, I wanted to bring Arnold up as an example of just how loyalties can change. Through the course of this episode, we have talked at length about the often pragmatic nature of loyalty that formed following the outbreak of the war. Benedict Arnold is in many ways the quintessential example of this. I am not here to debate if Arnold committed treason. He absolutely did. He had very clearly betrayed the cause to which he had pledged himself. What this shows is that risk that comes from a dissatisfied officer in a war that was, in so many ways, a civil war. Arnold had been loyal to the British once before, and after a sojourn over to the American cause, chose to switch back to where he began. We are not done talking about the Loyalists. As we wrap up this season and move into next season, we are going to come back a few more times to the Loyalists and their fates. As we have seen today, though, rather than being some arch-conservative villains of our story, the relationship between those supporting the cause of independence and those who chose to remain loyal to the British was a far more complicated thing. Next time, we are going to return to our narrative. If there had been a pause in fighting in 1779, 1780 would see the true opening of the British Southern strategy. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as we pick up with the campaign of 1780.